In Buddhism, the term anattā or anātman refers to the perception of not-self, recommended as one of the 7 beneficial perceptions, which along with the perception of dukkha and impermanence is also formally classified among the 3 marks of existence. Anatta in the Nikalas, the ancient Indian word for self or essence is atta or atman, and is often thought to be an eternal substance that persists despite death. Hence the term anatta is often interpreted as referring to the denial of a self or essence. Anatta is used in the early Buddhist texts as a strategy to view the perception of self as conditioned processes instead of seeing it as an entity or an essence. Taken together with the perceptions of anicca impermanence, and dukkha imperfection, anatta is the last of the 3 marks of existence, which, when grasped strategically, leads to dispassion. Dispassion then causes the mind to naturally tend to the deathless, and this is called release. Views on self equals existence and non-existence. When asked about the existence of the self, the Buddha often refused to answer. Instead, he pointed out the drawbacks of thinking in terms of existence and non-existence, and recommended that one view phenomena as arising and passing away, based on impermanent conditions. This means that instead of the question "is there a self?", it is recommended to ask, how does the perception of self originate? Identity view. Identity view is defined as one of the fetters to be abandoned, and a requirement for stream entry. By analyzing the characteristic of not-self as pervading all conditioned phenomena, and removing notions of self, and I-making, one is able to attain liberation. The Nikalas describe various views of self to be abandoned, such as this is mine, this I am, this is myself, I will be this, I will be otherwise, etc. A few of the suttas even see belief in no self as tied up with a belief in a self. Views of denial, in the form I am not this, or I will not be that, are thus rooted in the same I am attitude. Even the view I do not exist arises from a preoccupation with I. When demanded that the Buddha address the question of, who, as in, who feels, or, who is reborn, he often responded with a description of dependent origination, stating that the question of, who brings with it assumptions that are incorrect. Wrong self-views. There are 3 ways in which self-views could be conceived, and all 3 are said to be wrong views. A wrong view is not wrong because it is factually incorrect, but because it leads to dukkha. The first is the view that this is the self, which refers to identity view with regard to something, or passing blind judgment on the intrinsic quality of oneself. The second is the view that the self is contained in something else, which refers to identity view as contained in something else. The third is the view that the self possesses something else, which refers to the self possessing an entity such as a body. All these views types of identity view fetter one to samsara, and it is for this reason that they are wrong views. Eternalism and annihilationism. While the concept of jiva in Hinduism and Jainism is distinct from the Buddhist concept of a self, certain concepts of jiva are seen to contradict the notion of anatta. Eternalism, or the idea that there is a soul or jiva distinct from the body, raises the question of the existence of an eternal self, which the Buddha did not teach. Annihilationism, or the idea that the soul and the body are the same, implies the existence of a temporary self that is later destroyed upon death, which the Buddha also did not teach. Karma and anatta equals skillful action. Because most philosophers focus on asserting or rejecting a self, when people approach Buddhism, they assume it is answering the same questions. Thus they approach the Dhamma with the assumption that anatta is the basic framework, and wonder how karma could ever fit into such a framework. But this brings assumptions that have no bearing on the Buddha's way of teaching. The Buddha's central teaching framework was karma. Anatta is just one of the strategies that fit into this framework. Moral responsibility. The Buddha criticized 2 main theories of moral responsibility, the doctrine that posited an unchanging self as a subject, which he calls atthakavada, and the doctrine that did not do so, and instead denied moral responsibility, which he calls natthakavada. Instead, the Buddha repeatedly asserted that there are skillful and unskillful actions, and that the distinction between them is universal. In the Buddha's framework of karma, the perception of self is only skillful to the extent that it brings about right view regarding actions, and motivates one to choose skillful actions. equals developing the self equals. According to Peter Harvey, while the suttas criticize notions of an eternal, unchanging self, they see an enlightened being as one whose changing, empirical self is highly developed. One with great self is a mind which is not at the mercy of outside stimuli or its own moods, but is imbued with self-control, and self-contained. The mind of such a one is without boundaries, not limited by attachment or I-identification. One can transform oneself from an insignificant self into a great self through practices such as metta and mindfulness. The suttas portray one disciple who has developed his mind through loving-kindness saying, "Formerly this mind of mine was limited, but now my mind is immeasurable." Anātman in Mahayana Buddhism. There are many different views of anatta within various Mahayana schools. Majjhimakan equals. While commenting on a Euroriyadeva, Candrakirti defines anatta as follows. A Anātman is an essence of things that does not depend on others. It is an intrinsic nature. The non-existence of that is selflessness. Buddhapalita adds, while commenting on Nagarjuna's Malamodhimakaka. What is the reality of things just as it is? It is the absence of essence. Unskilled persons whose eye of intelligence is obscured by the darkness of delusion conceive of an essence of things and then generate attachment and hostility with regard to them. Tathagatagarbha Sutras equals, the Tathagatagarbha Sutras declare the existence of Atman, which in these scriptures is equated with Buddha nature. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra, a long and highly composite Mahayana scripture, refers to the Buddha using the term self in order to win over non-Buddhist ascetics. From this, it continues. The Buddha nature is in fact not the self. For the sake of guiding sentient beings, I describe it as the self. The Vaishnagatrava, a related text, points out that the teaching of the Tathagatagarbha is intended to win sentient beings over to abandoning affection for oneself, one of the 5 defects caused by non-Buddhist teaching. Yoru Wang notes similar language in the Lankavatara Sutra, then writes, "Noticing this context is important. It will help us to avoid jumping to the conclusion that Tathagatagarbha thought is simply another case of metaphysical imagination. According to some scholars, the Buddha nature discussed in these sutras does not represent a substantial self. Rather, it is a positive language and expression of angstrom jnata emptiness, and represents the potentiality to realize Buddhahood through Buddhist practices." Other scholars do in fact detect leanings towards monism in these Tathagatagarbha references. Relation to Vedic and Hindu philosophy. The pre-Buddhist Upanishads of Hinduism link Atman to the feeling I am. The Chandogya Upanishad, for example, does, and it sees self as underlying the whole world, being below, above, and in the 4 directions. In contrast, the Arhat says, above, below, everywhere set free, not considering this I am. While the pre-Buddhist Upanishads link the self to the attitude I am, others like the post-Buddhist Maitreya Upanishad hold that only the defiled individual self, rather than the universal self, thinks I am this, or I am that. According to Peter Harvey, this is very reminiscent of Buddhism, and may well have been influenced by it to divorce the universal self from such egocentric associations. The Upanishadic self shares certain characteristics with nirvana. Both are permanent, beyond suffering, and unconditioned. However, early Buddhism shunned any attempt to see the spiritual goal in terms of self, because in this framework, the craving for a permanent self is the very thing which keeps a person in the round of uncontrollable rebirth, preventing him or her from attaining nibbana. Harvey continues, both in the Upanishads and in common usage, self is linked to the sense of I am. If the later Upanishads came to see ultimate reality as beyond the sense of I am, Buddhism would then say, why call it self, then? See also. Notes. References. Bibliography, a note on Anatta in the Alagabha Sutta. K. R. Norman, Studies in Indian Philosophy LD Series, 84-1981, Recovering the Buddha's Message. R. F. Gombrich, Lama, Dalai. Healing Anger, The Power of Patience from a Buddhist Perspective. Translated by Geshe-Thupten Jinpa. Snow Lion Publications. Source: 1, Wynne, Alexander. the Atman and its negation. Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies 33, 103-171. External links: Nirvana Sutra, English translation of the Nirvana Sutra by Kushya Yamamoto.